I'm Aaron Prediabetes Inman.
And I'm Jesse Inman.
Today we're going to talk about sweet wine.
Some people love them, some people hate them, some people love to hate them, some people hate to love them, and some people, they don't know what they are.
Sweet wines are interesting. We don't make a sweet wine at Lucky Rock.
We make sweet wine.
Sweet wine.
But there's a comma.
As you'll see, there's a distinction. But a lot of people, it's very polarizing in wine. It's probably sweetness, perceived sweetness is probably one of the most poorly understood parts of the wine business. A lot of people will say, oh, there's no way I drink a sweet wine. But then they enjoy a Coca-Cola that's got 44 grams per can. So it's kind of interesting, and we'll dive into that a little bit. And here's your second favorite part of the show. We ask you to like and subscribe. Why don't you smash that fat red button down there at the bottom for us, please?
Please. So, Brother Aaron, what are we going to be talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about sugar in wine. So sugar's in all wines, but you can't taste sugar in all wines. And we're going to tell you how it's involved in the winemaking process, a little bit more about how it's involved in the perception of wines, and some different styles that involve different levels of sugar, residual sugar.
Okay, so from a winemaking standpoint, there's sugar in grapes. Sugar is glucose and fructose. Yeast eats sugar and creates heat, CO2, and alcohol.
Seems easy enough.
Easy enough. Sometimes you'll have a stuck fermentation. That means the yeast basically produce too much alcohol, they kill themselves. Sometimes winemakers will use it as a tool and leave sugar in there. They'll arrest fermentation, stop it by adding maybe something like sulfur, kills off the yeast or inhibits the yeast from fermenting anymore. And then there'll be a certain amount of sugar left in the wine to maybe balance out the of the wine, or maybe the acid's really high, like in, say, a German Riesling or something.
Or maybe, yeah,
stylistically, they'll leave 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 grams per liter.
900.
Yeah.
So simple, but complex, like many things in wine. And the other thing is it's very polarizing. People love to talk about sugar in wine, especially like the pundits in wine about like how, there's a lot of like, oh, sugar's bad, sugar's terrible. And then it's like, when they talk about that, they're talking more about like deceptively sweet wines, which we'll talk about maybe in a future episode, where people aren't being as truthful about what kind of profile their wines have.
Yeah, like I would say a lot of people don't realize how much sugar's in their Coca-Cola unless they look at the back, because it doesn't taste like it, but it's balancing something else.
Yeah, and so that leads us to one of those questions that a lot of people ask is, can you add sugar to wine? And you can, but it gets complicated. So like in Oregon, for example, well, prior to global warming, Oregon was a little bit cooler than California, maybe a lot of it.
And so, Portland's way cooler.
yeah. To some, that was a dreadlock. And so a single dreadlock.
Yeah.
Like they do in Portland. So when you talk about adding sugar to wine, a lot of what I'm talking about with Oregon is sometimes they weren't able to get that fully right.
Right.
And so they have higher acids, but they don't have as much sugar, which is, like we were talking about earlier, not going to give you as much alcohol, which is going to reduce the body of the wine and some of the flavor profiles and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So you could actually add sugar.
Pure sugar.
Chapelization.
In California you can't, but in Oregon you can.
Correct. And so you could add that to get the alcohol level up to where you wanted it to be. Now, in California, like Jesse was saying, it's illegal to add sugar to a wine.
I got put in jail once for it.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
It doesn't mean that you can't sweeten the wine.
Right.
Because you can add grape concentrate.
Yeah, you're adding sugar, but not CNH sugar. You're adding sugar from a natural
grape source.
Yeah, a natural grape source.
And so that's a little bit confusing to people. It's a distinction for sure. But at the end of the day, you can sweeten California wines. And that's where a lot of the people were talking about with like the polarization of wine is people adding back concentrate in California.
And to that point, you can add sugar before fermentation to get the alcohol up, to add more fuel for the yeast, basically, or you can add it after fermentation to increase the sweetness, and then it won't ferment anymore.
And to Jesse's point earlier, you can do that for different reasons. People have a proclivity towards sweetness.
Proclivity, good word. Good word.
I looked that up earlier. So there's that, but then there's also balancing out the acids and the tannins and things like that, and going for maybe a little more body in a wine. So there's a lot of stylistic reasons people do that. And I really think sugar's really gotten to be, Orphan Annie here.
Like I proclivity sugar myself.
Wait,
I used that wrong.
People are really like anti-sugar, and I get it to a certain extent. There's an issue with too much sugar in the American diet.
Maybe we should start adding stevia to our wine.
Well, you know what's kind of like stevia? Oak. You could think of
true. That's a
you
good
could think of oak. Oak is kind of the artificial sweetener of wine in a lot of ways.
A lot of flavors come from wood.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's one of the things is sugar kind of gets a little bit of bad rap, and I think if you over abuse it, of course, but a lot of times it's just a tool and there's no reason to hate a wine because it's got a little RS if it balances out that wine.
RS is residual sugar.
Bingo. All right, and so when you're making wines that are intentionally sweet, there's a spectrum, right? And so most wines that we're drinking in the States are considered more on the bone dry side. So if you've got the scale here, you've got bone dry here, which is less than 1 gram per liter of residual sugar, to you've got very sweet over here, which I think is 150 grams per liter plus, which seems crazy sweet, but then you're also, back to what we were talking about earlier, balancing out some of the acidity and different extractables and things of that nature. So it's about making a style and a balance.
Yeah. And so just from a more of a simple standpoint, you kind of know it when you taste it. You taste a bone dry wine, you're like, whew, that's got no sugar. It's like very high acid or lots of tannin. That's considered a dry. It might be off dry. It's just being hidden by something. And then there's like a semi-sweet or off-dry wine that you're like, oh, I think there's a little sugar in there. That's an off-dry wine. And if you're like, whoa, this is sweet, that's a sweet wine. Yeah, pretty simple scale.
Like to get into that, we're gonna taste 3 different wines today. One of them is bone dry. It's the Lucky Rock Sauvignon Blanc. There's no residual sugar in that. We had a healthy fermentation. All the sugars fermented.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's like 0.32 grams per liter, which is basically nothing.
Basically nothing. And I believe there's, just like anything else, some people can dunk a basketball, some people can't. Some people can have different thresholds of taste. And so some people, I believe the perceivable sweetness is around 2 grams for most people.
Okay, so for the first one, you got to drink your own Kool-Aid. We make this one. We know it's dry.
I heard it got 90 points recently. There's my dreadlock.
Here to us. So this is an intentionally dry wine. It's higher on the acid side, and so you could potentially leave a little sugar in there, but it's going to make it fatter. You want it a little bit more racy, a little bit more clean, and that's why we ferment it dry and don't leave any sugar in it.
And any sweetness that's perceived from this is really going to come from alcohol. Maybe there's a little bit of oak on this, so you're going to get some of those kind of that artificial sweetener from oak. And that's really about it.
And also high acid wines, maybe not Sauvignon Blanc per se, but things with high acid go through high fats because they kind of, again, clean right through it.
Sure.
Next up, we have Dr. Lucen, and it's the Schmirgedy Hammengeigenheimer.
The Guggenheimer.
And it's a Spätlese, which is a little bit higher on the sweet scale than most people picking it off the shelf would probably guess. But we'll see how it holds up in the wine.
Yeah, you're talking about around 62 grams per liter residual sugar
Diabetes
in this wine.
territory for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely sweeter than what I normally drink. I tend to drink mainly dry wines.
And this has a little bit of CO2 in it also, which will help kind of lift all the flavors up, but also helps cut through the sugar. So the sugar is cutting through the acid, and the CO2 is kind of cutting through the sugar.
To me, I would love this kind of wine. I tend to eat a lot of like spicy food, especially like Southeastern Asian. I love like Vietnamese food is probably one of my go-tos. And this kind of wine, and it's kind of cliche to say, but like a little bit of RS really helps curb the heat, like of the chili peppers and things of that.
So thirdly, we have the La Fleur de Renaissance, which is the Renaissance flower, if I remember correctly in French.
And when I was into poetry in high school, that was my stage name.
And this one has roughly 1 million grams of sugar per liter.
Yeah, this one is quite sweet, as they say in the biz.
So Sauternes are usually Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. They're usually infected or allowed to be infected with botrytis. And botrytis is they call it noble rot. It pulls moisture out, but it leaves acid and sugar in. So you get really high acid, really high sugar, which is usually kind of inverted.
And as you ripen too, we were talking about glucose and fructose earlier being the primary. As you get an overripe grape, you tend to have higher concentration of fructose than you do glucose, and fructose is about twice as sweet as glucose. So that also adds to some of the sweetness of these kind of wines.
They're actually really nice wines, but you start getting kind characteristics you wouldn't normally get in grapes because of the noble rot.
And it's very viscous because of that. It has a lot of weight compared to the Sauvignon Blanc was lighter, fresher, whereas the Dr. Lucen started to have a little more texture, a little more sweetness. And then this one has a lot of viscosity, and it's fairly sweet, but it has a lot of kind of like apricot and honeyed kind of notes. There's a reason that they tend to come out with the dessert card at the fancy restaurant when you're there for your anniversary or your prom. Oh, you kids can't drink, can they?
I mean, no.
But no, the card comes out with the coffee and the coffee cake and the stuff and the Saturns. There's a reason for that, because a lot of times if you're drinking these too early on, it can kind of crush your palate a little bit too, because it's sweet.
Well, now I have diabetes.
Well,
But outside of my diabetes, what did we learn today?
so aside from his diabetes, I think we learned that these wines have a different kind of time and place within your day. A lot of it's going to be around meals, which a lot of times wine is a go-to for mealtime. So these are just going to be kind of different styles of food, maybe different courses of the food. If you course at your house, I don't, but I do eat food and then have dessert.
Of course you do.
And so that's a big thing there. One thing I was going to throw out, we didn't talk about it, we don't want to go into everything, but if you're an avid champagne drinker, the sugar levels in champagne you really want to pay attention to, because you've got all the way from like the Brut, which is where I tend to play, which is kind of the 0 to 15 grams
there's
per
Brut
liter.
X and Brut Natural are almost nothing. And then Bruts are a couple grams.
And so then you've got your Sex and your Demi Sex and those kinds of things. And you do want to know those, because those are going to have different levels of sweetness that if you're a champagne drinker, you're going to want to know. But go to, if you want kind of a dry, maybe just slightly off dry, Brut's always a nice one.
Yeah, and I've had chefs tell me in the restaurant business when I was working with them, champagne pairs with anything.
Good days, bad days, rain, sun,
Yep.
champagne.
Yep.
We're going to go brush our teeth now because they're very sticky.
Thanks for joining us on this wild and extravagant ride.
You got any wine in there? We got to do a proper cheers. It's actually 7 years of bad luck, or is that a mirror?
I don't know.
Something. You got to have wine in your glass to cheers. Don't be that person at Thanksgiving that's ghost cheersing. Cheers. See ya on the next episode.